Hi, everyone.
Hello.
It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker this morning, Professor Graham Hubbs. Graham is an assistant professor in the philosophy department at the University of Idaho. His primary area of study is practical rationality, but he has recently been working on ethics in the digital age as well, including a project on WikiLeaks. Graham is also a member of the Toolbox Project, which helps facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration through epistemological intervention. Graham received his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh, right down the street, has led service learning courses in Tanzania, and is a former Fulbright scholar in Italy. And just a really quick personal note, I met Graham 10 years ago, maybe, and I met him because I was at a party that he was DJing, and I know my relationship with Graham, besides being intellectual and academic, is one where I went to lots of parties and DJed, and we've had conversations about music for about a decade. So when I told him about this project, he was very interested and has decided to come this morning and talk to us about digital music and public goods, which is the title of his talk. So please help me welcoming Graham Hubbs.
Thank you. I'm going to do what academic philosophers do and boringly read you a paper. I will try to make it as exciting as possible, but I want to be careful about the claims and distinctions I make, and so that's what I'm going to read. Introduction. In the summer of 2000, which for purposes of historical orientation predated the release both of iTunes and the iPod, the file sharing service Napster found itself in federal court accused of contributing to copyright infringement. Lawyers representing the United States recording industry asserted that Napster had, quote, deliberately built a business based almost exclusively on piracy. This characterization of file sharing as piracy implies that a person who downloaded a digital music file from Napster had thereby committed an act of theft. While Napster in its original guise has long since passed, the debate over whether peer-to-peer file sharing should be considered as a sort of theft has changed little. Just this past summer, a blog post on the topic by David Lowery received over 500,000 hits and over 500 comments. Lowery was responding to a post on NPR's All Songs Considered blog by Emily White. White was born in 1991 and claims in her post only to have purchased 15 CDs in her life. She admits to having obtained most of her music by copying files from friends or from the library of her college radio station, where she is a DJ. She asserts that most of her music has not been acquired via illegal downloading, so we may safely assume that White does not consider copying music either from her friends or from her radio station's library a form of theft. Lowery disagrees. He argues that from the artist's point of view, it does not matter whether songs are copied from an online file sharing service or offline from a disk drive or CD. Either way, the artist fails to be fairly compensated, which one may thereby conclude as a form of theft. Lowery's point is primarily an ethical one, not a legal one. He describes downloading decisions as, quote, personal ethical decisions, and characterizes the sharing of music files as a, quote, social injustice perpetuated against musicians. He does not accuse White of knowingly committing this injustice. Rather, he characterizes her as a young person confused by two competing worldviews. One, which he endorses, sees the unauthorized replication of music files as infringing on the rights of musicians to reap the fruits of their artistic labors. The other, which he calls the, quote, free culture movement, seeks to undo the principles that underlie the first view, quote, simply because it is technologically possible for corporations or individuals to exploit artist work without their permission on a massive scale and globally, end quote. He thinks that those who stand to benefit from the use of this technology are advocating a shift in morals, one which, in Lowery's view, is wrong. Lowery seems to suggest that many are confused or even brainwashed by this, quote, free culture mentality and therefore do not see the wrong in copying digitally encoded music. Describing the state of affairs back in the Napster and immediate post-Napster era, Steve Jobs had a different explanation. Quote, we believe that 80% of people stealing stuff don't want to be. There's just no legal alternative. According to this diagnosis, those in the early 2000s who downloaded music from peer-to-peer file sharing services believed that what they were doing was a form of theft, which they did not want to perform, yet were compelled to do anyway. This characterizes the typical Napster user as motivated by the following trio of desires. The desires for the track she wants to download, the desire to pay either little or nothing for the track, and the desire not to perform an act of theft. Although she recognizes downloading from Napster as an act of theft, her other two desires win out. For there is no way to satisfy all three of her desires simultaneously. One way to think of iTunes, and Jobs appears to have thought of it this way, is as providing a means to satisfy all three desires at once. The exchange between White and Lowry shows that iTunes has not fully realized Jobs' vision. To be sure, it has demonstrated that people will pay for music they can otherwise obtain freely. 1 million songs were downloaded on iTunes within 6 days of its going live, and it took less than 7 years for it to sell 10 billion songs. Indeed, so many people are now paying for downloaded music that in 2011, the recording industry saw increased sales in total units, which the RIAA counts as shipments, for the first time since 2004. White's is not the only way that personal music libraries are being built. Nevertheless, White is not an anomaly, neither in acquiring music via digital copying, nor in thinking that there is some difference between using an online service like Napster and borrowing a friend's hard drive. She fits Jobs' description of someone who does not want to acquire music by stealing, and she does not think she has built her library by a massive heist. I think there is good reason for White's view of her actions, one which I suspect has little, if anything, to do with being brainwashed by a, quote, free culture mentality. Digitally encoded music does not have the hallmark features of private property. This is especially true in peer-to-peer networks, where it instead has the hallmark features of what economists call a public good, hence the title of my paper. In this essay, I will argue that the clearest way to explain a wide range of behaviors involving music digitally encoded in data files, hereafter more simply just digital music, is to understand that music as a public good and so not as private property. To avoid confusion, I should state clearly at the outset several arguments and claims I will not be advancing. I'm not giving a psychological account of the motives that lead people to share digital music files. In the previous paragraph, I asserted White's activity makes sense given that digital music has the hallmark features of a public good. I did not claim that her action is motivated by her attending to those features. It should be obvious that I am not making a legal argument. The law does not treat digital music files as public goods, at least not those that are copyrighted. I'm also not making an ethical argument. I'm not claiming that we ought not to treat digital files of music as if they were property created by musicians. Continuing to treat digital music as private property might help musicians be compensated for their work, and few would assert that that is a bad thing. Instead, my argument is, we might say, metaphysical explanatory. Its goal is explanatory. More specifically, it aims at finding a common mode of explanation for a variety of phenomena involving digital music. Its means is metaphysical. It explains its target phenomena by articulating in general terms the relevant basic features of digital music. While its primary aim is explanatory, the account is not without normative implications. Specifically, if it is correct to say of digital music that it is a public good, then treating it as private property might be ultimately fruitless. If this implication holds, and if we still want musicians to be compensated for their work, we might need to seek alternative ways of funding musicians, and I will close this essay with some remarks on this point. All right, now for the metaphysics. Public goods. The concept of good at work here is in economists. An object may be a good in this sense, even if it may be used to perform harm or an injustice. A good in this sense need not be morally good. To understand what makes something a public good, we will not then contrast it with the concept of a public harm. Rather, we will contrast it with the concept of a private good. Unlike private goods, public goods are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. An object is rivalrous if one person's using it prevents another from using it at a point in time. Shovels are rivalrous. If I am using a shovel, you cannot, at that moment, use it as well. To say that a good is excludable is to say that it is possible and not prohibitively costly to exclude someone who is not paid from using it. Consider again my shovel. I can exclude you from using it by putting it in my locked garage, and I can thereby easily charge you for its use. If such exclusion is either impossible or overly costly, the good is non-excludable. Two classic examples of non-rivalrous, non-excludable, and therefore public goods are ubiquitous natural resources and lighthouses. Consider a natural resource such as oxygen in the air. This oxygen, at least if we conceive of it as a mass and not a collection of individual molecules, is not rivalrous. If we occupy a common space, like here, your breathing the oxygen in the air does not thereby preclude me from also breathing it as well. It is also non-excludable. It is impossible for someone to control the oxygen in such a way that he could force us to pay for its use. It is thus a public good. Lighthouses, though not natural goods, can also function as public goods. Put more carefully, when a lighthouse is on at night, the light it emits is a public good for all boats in its vicinity. One boat's using the light will only preclude another's from using the light if it happens that the former is large enough and positioned correctly to block the latter's line of sight. Otherwise, there is no rivalry. Nor, while the lighthouse is lit, is its use contingent on paying for it, A boat simply needs to be in the right position to take advantage of the good light. Private goods, unlike public goods, can be bought and sold, and when one buys a private good, part of what one buys is the capacity to exclude others from use of that good. Return again to my shovel. Suppose you buy it from me and take it home. Your purchase does not alter its rivalrousness. It remains as ever impossible for more than one person to use it at a time. It likewise remains an excludable good. Who can do the excluding, however, has changed. I no longer can force someone to pay me should she wish to use the shovel. That is now your prerogative. When you hand me money for the shovel, I give away something beyond the mere physical object. I also give you the capacity to exclude others from its use. As a legal matter, not every economic transaction involves the transfer of excludability. If a buyer purchases a copyrighted object, for example, she may acquire the capacity to exclude others from the copyrighted material, but she does not thereby obtain the right to do this. To understand the difference in this case between the capacity to exclude and the right to exclude, we must distinguish between the copyrighted material and its physical manifestation. Focus presently on books where these distinctions are conspicuous. The copyrighted material is, to a first approximation, the series and organization of letters, numbers, and punctuation marks in the book. To explicate this notion, we need at present only consider the following limiting case. Were someone to buy a copyrighted book, then to type a copy of it mark for mark on her computer, then to print what she had typed, then finally to sell the resulting printing, she would do so without right and therefore violate the copyright. By contrast, she has the right to sell the physical book she has purchased. She thus has the right to exclude others from use of the physical object, but she does not have the right to exclude others from the series and organization of letters, numbers, and punctuation marks printed on the object's pages. That right, which put more positively is the right to profit from the organization of language, belongs to the copyright holder. For the sake of clarity, note that library books, though they may be legally borrowed for free, are nevertheless rivalrous and excludable objects. That they are rivalrous should be obvious. If I have checked out a book, you cannot read it unless you read over my shoulder. They are excludable because their physical properties allow for them to be excludably possessed. Excludability, at least for present purposes, is not a legal matter. It is a property an object has if it is both possible and economically advantageous for someone to force another to pay for its use. Clearly, books do not lose these properties once they enter a library. So while library books are available for the public to read freely, they are not, in the sense presently operative, public goods. One feature that library books do share with public goods, however, is their tendency to be paid for by something other than private money. Public goods tend to be financed by something other than private money due to their non-excludability. If anyone can enjoy a public good without having to pay for it, then everyone has at least an initial, narrowly self-interested motive to avoid paying for the good. If no one pays for a good, of course, it may fail to be delivered. If, for example, no one pays for the maintenance of the lighthouse, it might fall into disrepair and cease functioning. It is common then, even among fiscally conservative economists, to see public goods that are especially important to a given group of individuals as legitimately financed by public means. Perhaps more so even than lighthouses. Armies are examples of such goods. They are important for self-defense. The benefits of their activities are neither rivalrous nor excludable, so to provide the specific sort of good they offer, it makes sense to finance them through public means. With these remarks and distinctions in place, let's now turn to our discussion of digital music. Section entitled, The Metaphysics of Old Musical Media. There is an active philosophical literature on the ontology of music, which attends to the differences between musical compositions, performances of these compositions, experiences of those performances, and related features of music. I shall have nothing to say here about which of these is, quote, really music. For present purposes, we will define a given piece of recorded music as a specific range of sounds produced by speakers, an amplifier, and a frequency mixer, all functioning normally. This definition is hedged by the terms range and normally to acknowledge that a piece of music may be played louder or softer, with more or less bass or treble, on better or worse speakers, and still be the same music, in virtue of what is common between the diverse sounds produced. Conceived of this way, music is essentially diachronic. It unfolds through time. While music itself is essentially diachronic, it can be, as we will use the term, embodied in a variety of static media. Vinyl records embody music in etchings in the vinyl. Cassette tapes embody music in arrangements of ferric oxide. Compact discs embody music in a series of polycarbonate bumps.
In each of these instances, there is a broader medium in which the music is embodied: the whole vinyl record, the whole reel of cassette tape, the whole compact disc. Each of these is what a philosopher would describe as a medium-sized physical body, capable of being carried, thrown, hidden, etc. All of these objects are, qua objects, rivalrous. For ease of presentation, just focus on vinyl records. Also, for ease of presentation moving forward, let the term album designate a collection of music in any media, and let record designate vinyl discs. A record is rivalrous for the same reason that any medium-sized physical body is rivalrous. If I have a record in my possession, you cannot play it, or for that matter, do anything else with it. While this musical embodiment qua object is rivalrous, its proper use produces a non-rivalrous good. Should I play the record, the music that comes from it is non-rivalrous for those within hearing distance, for the same reason that light from a lighthouse is non-rivalrous for those within viewing distance. So far, we have considered the record as an object, and we have considered the music it produces when played. Neither of these, however, is the most important way, at least in the context of present discussion, to conceive of a given musical record, or for that matter, any other physical manifestation of an album. When a record is not being played, the potential for the music it embodies is both a rivalrous and an excludable good. Consider a record I own that you do not. I can listen to its music whenever I want. You cannot do the same unless you get the record, so the good that is its potential music is rivalrous. If I like the record, I will not want to relinquish the ability. Because it is possible and in my self-interest to keep others from taking this ability from me, the good that is this ability, this potentiality, is also excludable. Should I sell my record, I exchange the ability to listen to its song whenever I want for the money I receive. As goes the record, so goes the ability. Because the physical vinyl disc is rivalrous, so too is the ability. That is, of course, unless I make a copy of the music on the record. With the advance of domestic cassette recorders, it became possible to make a new embodiment of a given bit of music, and thereby keep the unlimited ability to listen to it even after selling the original object of embodiment. With cassettes, the copies tended to be subpar, but with the advent of the domestic compact disc writer, one was able to make copies that to the average listener were acoustically indistinguishable from their source. These copies were new musical embodiments, possessed of all the metaphysical properties described above. They were, qua objects, excludable. Their proper use produced a non-excludable good, and in their use they contained the excludable possibility of the music recorded on them. The physical embodiment of the music in a medium-sized body resulted in a replication of all of these metaphysical features. Consider these features now exclusively from the perspective of a person who wants to own a given album she does not presently have. If she goes to a store to get the album, she will find herself excluded. She will either need to pay for the album or she will need to steal it, in which case she risks being caught for theft. She can avoid both paying and being caught stealing from a store if she either borrows and copies a friend's copy or arranges for the friend to make a copy. There are two things to note in the latter case. First, whether she or the friend makes the copy, the result will be a medium-sized object containing the music as well as all the metaphysical properties listed above. Second, whether she or the friend makes the copy. While the copy is being made, the friend must forfeit the rivalrous good of listening to the album whenever she wants. This is clearest if the friend lends the album, but even if the friend makes a copy for her, he cannot, while making the copy, use the album as he pleases. Should he choose, for example, to listen to tracks in something other than their original order, he will not be making a copy of the album. The album cannot be copied without tacitly acknowledging its rivalrousness or its excludability, so it has the necessary properties of a bit of private property. Next section, the metaphysics of digital music files in a peer-to-peer network. There are many ways in which the shift to embodying music in data drives has been revolutionary, and one is that music recordings for the first time have become non-rivalrous and effectively non-excludable. Consider anew our character from the previous paragraph in a world with music files available on peer-to-peer networks. She will be excluded from these files if she lacks internet access, but let us suppose that this is not an issue. Suppose that she joins a peer-to-peer file sharing group online, searches for a song she wants, and finds it. She encounters no rivalry if she seeks to copy the file. Indeed, it is possible that the person whose file she is copying is at that moment listening to the music embodied on it. She is not excluded from the file. She can obtain it without pay. For her, the file is like the light coming from the lighthouse, a non-rivalrous, non-excludable good. For her, it is a public good, not a bit of private property. To be sure, the law does not treat the file this way if the music on the file is copyrighted. Under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the file is to be treated as a rivalrous good. It is to be used only by the individual who paid for the file. Moreover, it is only to be used in restricted ways. Specifically, it is not to be used as the basis of a copy. The need to spell these regulations out, of course, follows from the fact that these files can be used otherwise, and of course, that a copyable item can be copied and sold by the copier for a profit is the basis of copyright law. Prior to the digital embodiment of information, however, in order to acquire a copied text or bit of music, one had to acquire a medium-sized object in which the text or music was embodied. Any such object is rivalrous and excludable good, a bit of private property. By acquiring that good, one acquired the ability to use the text or music embodied in that medium. To acquire the ability, it was not only sufficient to possess the property, but also necessary. Without possession of the rivalrous and excludable good, the person did not possess the capacity for its use. With the digitization of text and music, one need not acquire a medium-sized object in order to acquire the ability to use the text or music. What one acquires is, practically speaking, spaceless, a spaceless copy of a spaceless original. The spacelessness of the original allows it to be accessed without depriving its owner of the possibility of using it while it is accessed. This spacelessness makes the object non-rivalrous. It does not follow that the object is necessarily there non-excludable. One can imagine any number of ways of devising toll booths to require payment for access. Peer-to-peer sharing networks, however, have no such toll booths, so any files in these networks are not excludable. These files thus have the characteristic features of public goods, not of private property. So any music encoded in them likewise has the characteristic features of a public good. Once we conceive of digital music in this way, we have an explanatory framework for analyzing a variety of phenomena involving this music. It can, for example, help reveal a common thread between a series of stories recently broadcast on NPR on the present state of the music industry. On September 24th of this year, Morning Edition broadcast an interview with Grizzly Bear that included discussion of making money off of music in the digital age. The week progressed with segments on Kickstarter, Spotify, and YouTube. The members of Grizzly Bear claim that it is presently very difficult to make money off of record sales, in large part because music can be legally obtained at a very low cost. The report on Spotify backs up these claims. Independent artists make less than a half a cent per play of their tracks there. This is a source of complaint for some musicians. To such complaints, the executives at Spotify respond that Spotify has created a legal alternative to unauthorized file sharing sites, such as the torrent site, the Pirate Bay. The report on YouTube involves similar claims, which were demonstrated this morning in the introduction. Users report listening to songs on YouTube instead of buying music, and artists complain that compensation from YouTube has been minimal. Common not only to Spotify and to YouTube, but to non-authorized sites as the Pirate Bay, is the non-rivalrous, non-excludable character of the music at the sites, at least as they presently operate. The music on offer at all of these sites has the characteristic features of a public good. Because of this, and because public goods, as we saw in our brief discussion of armies, necessarily pose funding problems, it should come as no surprise that artists receive so little money from Spotify or YouTube. Once a bit of music has been digitally encoded, it can, and more often than not is, put in one of these media where it is neither rivalrous nor excludable. Should a given service, say for example Spotify, change its policies to make its customers pay for its use, its music would thereby not become excludable. Users could simply switch, perhaps back to using unauthorized services. This demonstrates one of the more profound metaphysical consequences of, as we might put it, the disembodying music into data files. Once this process effectively makes a bit of music a public good, no other copy of that music is, for anyone with non-excludable access to the music, effectively a public good. As argued above, the principal feature we should attend to in characterizing a bit of music as public or private is its potential to be played. Prior to encoding this potentiality in data files, it was necessarily embodied and so was necessarily rivalrous and excludable. The disembodiment of this potentiality into data files in turn renders the potentiality non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Spotify might opt to change its practices, but it cannot alter the metaphysics of digital music. This last point can help shed light on the differing views of White and Lowery presented in the introduction. First, recall the distinction that White sees between downloading files from a peer-to-peer network and copying a friend's files. She conceives of acquiring files through a peer-to-peer network as wrongfully taking a bit of private property, and of copying a friend's files as something else. On the present analysis, the difference here is not best captured as the difference between stealing and legitimate copying. Rather, it is the difference between ways of accessing a non-rivalrous, non-excludable good. If she obtains a file via a peer-to-peer network, she does so without depriving anyone else of the use of a rivalrous excludable good. There is a difference between this and what she does when she copies a friend's file. There, she must temporarily deprive her friend of some rivalrous excludable good of his in order to make the copy. The latter act of copying involves private property. The rivalrous and excludable good involved, however, is just the physical drive. If the music on it can be obtained through a peer-to-peer network, then that music effectively is a public good, which she happens to access from a bit of private property. Seen in this light, Lowry is correct that the distinction White marks is, as philosophers sometimes say, a distinction without a difference. But the reason there is no difference is that however the good is obtained, it has the hallmark features of a public good. Thinking of music as a public good can also help us understand the decision to fund musicians through Kickstarter. The NPR piece on the topic describes the use of Kickstarter towards this end as, quote, internet-based crowdsourcing, which it characterizes as follows. It works like a sort of bake sale. You pay a little bit more than the cupcake's market value, and when your friend asks where you got it, you tell them the gym needs a new roof and the 11th grade is raising money to fix it. Album sales are less than half what they were 10 years ago. Your local musician needs a new roof. This analogy misses the mark. At a bake sale, you give money, albeit more than the market would demand, for an excludable rivalrous good to Cupcake, knowing that the profits will contribute to building what, for the students, when they are in the gym, is a non-excludable, non-rivalrous good. A Kickstarter project need not and often does not involve any initial exchange of a private good for money. Rather, each contributor promises to pay her promised share if the pledge goal is reached. The initial economic exchange thus need not involve the donor receiving any private good in exchange for the donation. On the present analysis, the analogy does, or at least can, capture the relation between the donated monies and what they fund. Like the monies raised from selling cupcakes, Kickstarter donations are contributions to a future public good. The roof in the analogy, however, does not belong to the artist. The roof is the music, and it belongs, as do all other non-rivalrous, non-excludable goods, at once to no one and to everyone. In spite of its confused analogy, this NPR piece is perhaps more helpful than the rest in pointing out a natural solution to some of the problems created by the new metaphysics of digital music. As already noted, if we think of digital music as a public good, we should not be surprised if it proves difficult to fund privately. Private funding requires people to ignore how different digital music is from medium-sized objects. Indeed, it is remarkable how successful iTunes has been at habituating people to ignore these differences. The power of Apple is mighty, and I have no basis for suggesting that eventually iTunes will run its course. That said, it should come as no surprise that many have responded to the non-rivalrous, non-excludable features of digital music by massively circulating files, which in turn creates the funding problem typical of public goods. Some sort of public model seems a natural solution to this problem, so it should not be surprising to see Kickstarter filling this void. I said at the outset that the explanatory framework I would be using, if it fits, implies certain normative consequences, and I'm now in a position to explicate that claim. If digital music is effectively a public good, then funding it through quasi-public means such as Kickstarter is not only to be expected, it is proper. If we assume that artists deserve to be compensated for their work, and if what they produce is a public good, then we should not expect that they will get what they deserve as long as we go on treating their work as private goods. It is unreasonable to expect listeners to treat non-rivalrous, non-excludable goods as if they were rivalrous and excludable. This calls for inventing and developing alternate means of funding, which are sensitive to the public nature of the goods produced. Should one complain that this depends too heavily on the charity of listeners, I would respond that paying for something you can get for free is already a form of charity. By successfully incentivizing this charity, iTunes has delayed, perhaps indefinitely, the widespread acknowledgement of the non-rivalrous, non-excludable character of digital music. But metaphysics has a way of being recalcitrant to false belief. The Earth was spinning around the sun for millennia before Galileo took note of the fact. If the nature of digital music makes funding it through public schemes a better option than private alternatives, then we might do well to focus our energy on devising appropriate funding schemes instead of pretending that the record is still the center of the musical universe. Thank you.
I was wondering if your argument for digitized music as non-excludable and non-rivalrous and thus public property, if and how your argument accounts for any distinguishment between published and non-published works.
So the claim that I was Okay, the way that I'm drawing the distinction attends to the properties that a particular object, and here I've got to use object in an abstract sense to talk about music and digital books and so forth, the properties that they have with respect to access for just you or me or whatever. So from that point of view, when you think about it from the point of view of accessing the object itself, there is no distinction to be made. That's not to say that there aren't distinctions to be made, that there aren't legal distinctions to be made, and that there aren't perhaps good ethical distinctions that should be made with respect to whether something is put out. Your distinction was between copywritten and non-copywritten?
I'm thinking specifically over things that have been published via BMI, ASCAP, whatever.
Right.
Versus like
So,
an artist putting something on Bandcamp and saying, pay what you will, or
Right.
here's my mixtape.
good. So the part of what I want to, I don't want to advocate a very strong view here about what we should do. The goal, again, is intended to be metaphysico-explanatory. Like, we have new kinds of objects out there when you have MP3s that exist in peer-to-peer networks. And the old ways of thinking about reimbursing artists and creators for their labors work really well when you have a medium-sized physical object like a CD or a tangible book or an album or something like that you have to generate physical copies of, and you can track the generation of those copies and pay back on the basis of that. The things are just different when you don't have anything physical that needs, something physical happens in your hard drive, but it's, as I said, effectively spaceless, right? So from the point of view that I'm trying to discuss the features of these objects, there is no difference. And I think if we want artists and authors to be compensated for their labor, we would do well to attend to the fact that there is no difference of access from copywritten and non-copywritten objects, and say how do we fairly compensate dealing with the metaphysical reality that these things just don't have any difference to them, and acknowledging that that's different than where we've come from for hundreds and hundreds of years.
I saw it. Yeah.
Maybe it's yeah. Well, I also have a question about this issue. Yeah. Well, I agree with your conclusions that non-rivalrous, non-exclusive media objects should be publicly funded somehow. I'm really confused by your characterization of public versus public property and private property as kind of like inherent properties of a media object.
Okay.
Like I might be like not with that philosophically object oriented, but to me private property is a relationship between the people.
Okay.
And it's like an enforced relationship, and so like if you were making an example of like a shovel, and that can be public to me. It's just not public because if I steal your shovel, you can call the cops, and so like it's like a mutually kind of like agreed things. You have the ability to enforce this, and there are laws to enforce this. Same thing for the you were mentioning oxygen and stuff. Like water might be in a weird threshold right now because it's always been considered as a public. In the public domain, but they are basically when there is a power relationship that is able to turn a public property into private property, that the relationship changes, and it's not like an intrinsic kind of characteristic of water or music.
I don't disagree with anything that you've said, and the very notion of right, I think, is an attempt to either moralize or legalize the kinds of power relations that you're talking about. But I think that we can, maybe I'm just naive about this, but I think that we can abstract away from thinking about objects either morally or legally and say, with a shovel, for example, rivalrousness should be a feature of something irregardless of what kind of moral or legal setting that you're in. If I'm using a shovel, you can't use it, right? That's by definition what it is for something to be rivalrous. One individual's use precludes another from using that thing at that time. And I think that that's one of the most striking. I'm more interested in the non-rivalrousness of MP3s in peer-to-peer networks than anything having to do with excludability, because I think that's what's most striking. Right? It was very easy 10, 15 years ago to borrow somebody's CD and copy it and make a copy, but you had to take the physical thing away from that person for a few minutes to make the copy. That doesn't happen anymore. Like I can be sitting at home listening to my MP3, and if I've decided to make it available via a peer-to-peer network,
it's just available for someone else who's on that network to take it. I think that, and I mean, I think I can say similar things about excludability, but as far as rivalrousness goes, I do think that these are facts that we can characterize in abstraction from thinking of any particular moral or legal setting.